It's September 27th, 2017, and today I will be talking to you about early Christian, Jewish, and Byzantine art. So my first slide, and those of you that have been following me from the beginning know that I love maps. So here is a map of Judea, Dura Europos, Rome, and Ravenna. So of course Judea is our site for Judaism and the originality of Christianity, and we'll find that Judea becomes a hotbed, and still is today, of course, because all three religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, see this area as sacred to them for one reason and another. So it's very interesting to trace the roots of all three of these religions, along with their artwork, and if you get involved in it, reading some of the stories. So if you look, you can see that Ravenna and Rome are in Italy, and of course those are going to be Christian sites. And Judea, of course, has all three with it. Dura Europos is over in the Middle East, the Near East, and it's where the first house churches were. So let's get started. I have an outline for the first slide here for Jewish, and it's Jewish and early Christian art. I've kind of lumped them together because honestly there isn't as much Jewish art per se. They used it for storytelling, but they don't use art in the way that Christians do. So the early Christian period is from 100 CE to about the 6th century. And then we have the Byzantine Empire comes from the early 5th century, middle, and then late all the way to 1261 in the 16th century. So there's going to be some overlaps here with medieval art and even into the Romanesque period. So, of course, we begin in the Roman Empire, and we just finished, of course, a study of the Roman Empire, and right at the end, we looked at Constantine. We'll be looking at him again. Now, we have documentation of early Christianity from around 70 Common Era, 70 to 100 Common Era. And of course, as you recall, the Common Era is roughly the time that Christ was born. So we can see that it begins somewhere around 40 years after he dies. And it takes root, of course, during the Roman Empire, although it's illegal to be a Christian all the way up until around 300, the early beginning of the 4th century. So in the Byzantine era, we divide this into early, middle, and late Byzantine. And late Byzantine, of course, goes all the way up almost to the Gothic era. But there's three religions that began in the Near East, that began in Judea. And these three religions have shaped Western culture: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, Islam, we have a separate unit for that we'll look at after this. But these are called the three religions of the book, meaning book with a capital B. So interestingly, historically, Jesus was born around 3 or 4 years after he was born, I like to say, or 4 or 3 BCE during the rule of Caesar Augustus. So if you remember the Augustus of Prima Porta, and on the breastplate of Augustus of Prima Porta, we see the Zeus figure with all of its attendant regalia. Many of these images come into Christian imagery showing Christ the King. Now, Jesus may have died during the rule of Tiberius, who was Augustus's stepson. We're not sure. But either way, Judea was solidly under the control of the Romans. So it's a new religion, and so it borrows imagery from two traditions, from Judaism and, of course, also the Greco-Roman tradition. So it comes out of Judaism because, of course, Jesus practiced the Jewish religion, and the Last Supper was a Jewish Seder. Greco-Roman, that's the culture that it is, and this is what happens in art history, is that it's always a blend. It's a blend of the cultures of whatever people are living at the time, as well as their belief systems. So visual imagery, as we've seen up until now, it's always served an important role as communication in the ancient world. And again, I go back to Augustus of Prima Porta. Think of this see this emperor who had made propaganda statues of himself and put them in every single square to talk about his greatness. This was done with visual imagery. They don't have TV, they don't have radio, they don't have the internet, they don't have iPhones. So they're using visual imagery without the spoken word to communicate ideas. So iconography becomes central to the spread of Christianity. And you can read in your book, there's a little section called Myth and Religion, or Art and Its Contexts. Cemeteries and catacombs are very important in early Christian and Jewish art because for one thing, Christianity is illegal, so they practice it down there. And graveyards are catacombs that are outside the city walls. There are all these huge system of tunnels, and it's not like a graveyard like you think of when you drive from Elizabethton to Johnson City and you see the gravestones. It's a great underground city, like a necropolis. And so there were catacombs for more than one religious faith, and they've been around for a long time. So people are comfortable in them. They bury their dead there. They're, pretty good sized chambers where they hold their funeral services and things like that. So the grave diggers are, quote unquote, the architects of the underground in ancient Rome. And they actually become the artists as well for a lot of the imagery they paint. So in the 3rd century CE, they begin painting these catacombs with prayers for salvation. And so by the 4th century, of course, it becomes more elaborate. We're going to look at early Judaism first. And so there's a good explanation in your book. I'll just give you the high points here. Hebrews, of course, originated from Palestine, and that's where early Judaism came from, and it's chronicled in the Old Testament in the Bible. Canaan is the homeland that they believe is given to them by God, and they began the settlement of Canaan around the 2nd millennium BCE, so back during the time of the Egyptians, and of course they were enslaved by the pharaohs as well. Their religion is based on law. And they housed what they called the tablets of the law in the Ark of the Covenant. So this Ark of the Covenant is their most sacred concept, their most sacred object. And they use ritual objects, including books and the menorah. The menorah is a candlestick, and all of these things are very sacred to them. And their rituals include commemorative meals. The Passover would be one, and then the Seder is part of that. So there is an emphasis on religious learning. There's an emphasis on their individual relationship with God. Here's just a little kind of bullet point history for you. Around 1000, around the 10th century BCE, Solomon built a temple in Jerusalem for the Ark of the Covenant. This is a historical fact. So the Ark was housed there. So that'd be 2,100 years ago, 2,000 years ago, they had it. And then in 586, remember the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar II? Remember that Ishtar Gate? They conquered Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple. They took away the Ark of the Covenant, and they exiled the Jews. So that all happened about 2,500 years ago. And then in 539, so about 50 years later, Cyrus, who was part of the Persians, conquered Babylonia again, and they let the Jews come back. And if you look at the book of Ezra in the Old Testament, there's a story about that. So after the Jews come back, 500 years later, in 34 BCE, Herod comes along, and he restores the temple. And then, of course, as we saw in the last unit, Titus came and looted and destroyed it in 70 CE. And remember the Arch of Titus, they were all carrying the menorah and the covenant and all, and that's the last time we've seen it. So we don't know what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. And some people say that's the Holy Grail. Anyway, this temple site, it's also an Islamic site for reasons that you'll see when we come to the study of Islam, and it's called the Dome of the Rock. So all three religions, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, venerate this site of this temple that Solomon built back 3,000 years ago. Here's a picture of the Ark of the Covenant and the Menorahs in the third, and this was drawn in the 3rd century CE. This is a picture of Jewish artwork, and they would have used this to explain what the Ark of the Covenant was, what's inside it, what the symbolism of the menorahs is. And again, you've seen this imagery before. You saw it on the Arch of Titus. This is another good example of the kind of things we see in early Jewish art. And of course, as with all of these images I'm showing you, I show you one or two things, and if you're interested in it, you can go online, you can find many, many more. This is an example of a banquet scene. It's a wall painting from a lunette in the catacomb of Priscilla. So we know whose catacomb this was, from Rome in the late 2nd or early 3rd century. And this is a Passover Seder. So Jewish art is often depicted showing ritual meals, very simplified forms. And this particular one is a Jewish one, but these banquet scenes do end up being appropriated in Christian art to depict the Last Supper. But of course, when it's the Last Supper, it will show Jesus with his 12 disciples. Generally, he's in the middle with 6 disciples on either side. So we can see from this image that that's not who's in this picture. So both of those were catacombs outside Rome. This is an image, a Jewish image from a house synagogue in Dura Europos in Syria. Now, Dura Europos is a very interesting site because people worshipped in their homes there, and we have Jewish art and Christian art. We have some house synagogues. We also have house churches there. So it's a representation of a variety of religious traditions that flourished in this frontier Roman society. There's shrines to Mithras, who was a Roman god. Many soldiers worshipped to Mithras. We have Zoroastrians. We learned about them when we looked at the art of the ancient Near East. They were the first people, actually, that had a monotheistic religion, interestingly. And if you recall, they did believe in dark and light, and they depicted their god as a winged disc, if you recall. There are also, of course, shrines to other Roman gods and Christians, and then Jewish house synagogues. So this is a Jewish one. It's a detail of Moses giving water to the 12 tribes of Israel. So again, this is a Jewish subject about the origin of the 12 tribes. Now, one thing that's interesting here is we can see these orant figures. If you look all the way around, see the men, they have their hands up. They have their hands up like this, and this hands up and looking up is an ancient form of prayer. That standing, worshiping, looking to the sky is one of the oldest prayer positions. It's interesting to think about that. And that prayer position gets brought into Christian art in many ways, as you'll see with the first Christian images. Above the wall, we have a menorah, and it's framed by a Corinthian portico. So we see the classical architecture in this. And then Moses over here. Moses is a combination. He's a bearded Old Testament patriarch, but he's wearing a toga. So he's wearing Roman clothing. And then we see this classical influence, just this little bit of contrapposto in the folds of the drapery around his right leg. So many different influences in this image. Now, Judaism forbids religious imagery, but they did let images come into their synagogues because they used them for teaching. So the Torah is the first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures, and it parallels the Old Testament. And so they study this Torah. They sit along in benches along the walls, and the rabbi will take one or another scrolls and instruct the worshipers. So the images are just very, very simple illustrations, almost like cartoons or like a graphic novel kind of thing. They're really meant for people that can't read, so they can look at the pictures and listen, and it can help them visualize, help them learn. So the Jewish people, it's very interesting because they understood so completely how many people are visual learners. Here's a close-up of one of them. This is the finding of the baby Moses. The baby noses, oh my God. This is an image of the finding of the baby Moses. And Moses was, set adrift in a little boat made of papyrus reeds, and then an Egyptian princess found him, and he was raised in Egyptian culture, and then he let all the Jewish people, he got them freed from slavery from the Egyptians. So this is a continuous narration. There's many different time periods. You can see that he's being found. You can see the little cart that he was in floating along the river. You can see later on as he's older. So this is called continuous narration, having several different parts of a story collapsed into one image. If you notice the style now, they're very flat. There's no attempt at modeling. They're not trying to make them realistic at all. They're just giving us an idea of dress. The foreground motif is just very stylized, repeated patterns, frontal figures, heavy outlines, big eyes. And much of this heavy outline and big eye, this type of drawing carries through, this clarity carries throughout Christian art, and particularly into Byzantine art later. So it's just simple. It's just meant to tell a story. So we'll see this with early Christian art as well. The objective is just to teach. That's the most important thing about it. So that's what we have for Jewish art. And you can extrapolate, I hope, from those few images the extent, there of course are many temples and many places where different illustrations are created. Interestingly, the Jewish culture is persecuted throughout history, and even up into the 16th century, which goes beyond the scope of this course, but there's just one or two examples in Germany of Jewish synagogues and this type of imagery that they used. They stay consistent through the centuries, but many of those synagogues, of course, were destroyed. A great Jewish population in Poland, Jewish populations in Russia, different places where the population was destroyed, their synagogues were destroyed as well. And I, of course, wonder whether the reason that we have less Jewish art is for the same reason in ancient times. And of course, back when they were slaves. They weren't allowed to build for themselves. So these few sites that we have, I think, are very precious because it's one of the times in history where they were relatively free to worship as they pleased to. Anyway, early Christianity, we have one God manifest in three persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Jesus is thought of as the Son of God, and his ministry on earth ended with crucifixion. So these ideas are things that the early Christians believed and codified as a belief system. Now, Christianity was illegal up until 300 CE, and 313 was the date that Constantine issued the Edict of Milan. And of course, there's a great deal of scholarly writing around that particular century. And by that time, of course, many statesmen were practicing Christians, and some of them didn't come out as Christians until they died. So it's interesting to see. The belief was actually formalized at the Council of Nicaea in 325. So these ideas that I've listed for you here come out of that council, but they were forming for that 300 years. And so there was a period after Jesus died and during the time that the apostles wrote the letters. Apostle Paul wrote letters to, they went out to Thessalonica, they went out to Ephesia, they went, into the Mediterranean. If you look in the New Testament, all the different places where Paul sent letters to, and much of the New Testament, of course, is letters, that even during that time they were forming this belief system. And so they codify it in 325. And along with this, there becomes very complex relationships between the church and state. So with Christianity, this is early on, the secular and the religious and seats of power. This is not something you see with Judaism. Constantinople, named after Constantine, of course, becomes the center of power and culture after Rome. So, characteristics of early Christian art, again, it's concerned with teaching. That's a holdover from the Jewish art, and that stays throughout Christian history, but it morphs also. So here's some characteristics of early Christian art style. 1, the artist brings the subject very close to the viewer. They're very flat and frontal, so very similar to what we just saw from the Jewish banquet or the finding of the baby Moses. Very little emotion or none, because it's about teaching. It's not, the people represent a story. They don't represent individual persons. There's pure color, so it portrays pure form. They like to use symmetry and clarity. Now, Christianity had a strong appeal to the poor people. The stories were well communicated, they were easy to understand, and they resonated with them. The images, of course, were a way to teach people who couldn't read, and the earliest images we find, again, in Christian burial sites called catacombs. So the little rooms inside a catacomb are called cubiculi. The first Christians in Rome were not members of a social class that could patronize skilled artists, although, as you'll see in the latter images of early Christian art, we do have clear evidence that the patrons were from a more well-heeled class. But the very first Christians didn't have any money at all, and they were rebels in a way. So a lot of the artists are the grave diggers, and most of the works are done with fresco, which is cheap and easy. It can be done really quickly. So they have to be painted quickly before the plaster dries, and also they're having to do it in secret, so that because it's illegal, they'll be executed. So the brush strokes we see are rapid, often sketchy, very relaxed figures, but very clear. So here's our first image we're going to look at. This is from a Christian catacomb, and it actually is a catacomb that contains the bones of St. Pietro and Marcellino. And the ceiling has 5 medallions linked by the arms of a cross. And it's called The Good Shepherd, Oryx, and the Story of Jonah. And we're going to see the whole thing in a minute. But I wanted you to see the Christ as the Good Shepherd first, surrounded by the lambs, because this becomes one of the most iconic and important bases for all of Christian art, even into today. The emphasis in this entire piece is on story and symbols, but you can see the quick brush strokes, just this circle painted in haste. The hand of the artist is so evident in this. So Christ is in the center, and then Jonah and the whale, there's a story of Jonah and the whale surrounding him, and of course you can see it's damaged, a lot of it's missing. So when it was first done, it would have been much, much brighter, of course, and clearer, but you can get the idea. So this is, again, the start of a new theme, that Old Testament stories become allegories for events in Christ's story. So as Jewish art depicted narratives from the Old Testament, this continues, but now layered onto it are the stories of Christ's life, which becomes together, the old and the new becomes the new religion of Christianity. This is kind of a little bit better view. So here's our ARTH figures again, surrounding the Christ and the Good Shepherd. And then in the lunettes, we have, of course, Jonah. Here he is with the whale. So Christian art is always thematic and symbolic. This doesn't change. And religious imagery often involves a program, or they call it a cycle, also. So the themes relate to one another. So a cycle here, the cycle of Christ as the Good Shepherd and the story of Jonah, the narrative. So in the first zone, which would be zone 1, that's the center. So of course, that's the primary theme. And then zone 2 are these orant figures, these standing figures who are just praying with outstretched arms. So as they raise their arms, they're bringing all of God's glory into this room and into this imagery and making this connection between Christ as the Good Shepherd and Jonah in the whale, this religious man who gets released after 3 days. So the story of Jonah, of course, is set in this world. And then the story of Christ, he rose after 3 days into the kingdom of heaven. So that's the heavenly realm. So we have this connection between the real world, quote unquote, and the heavenly realm. This theme of the Good Shepherd brings the verses in John 10 and 11 as a Christian theme. Also, the theme of the 23rd Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me down to lie in green pastures. And furthermore, the Greco-Roman tradition uses the theme of the shepherd to evoke images of this idyllic, perfect world, peace, harmony are involved in pastoral simplicity. We often see pagan gods, Apollo and Hermes, shown with shepherds. So one reason why this was such an easy segue is that Christianity is illegal in the Roman Empire and Christians are often persecuted, so they can hide in plain sight, if you will, by continuing these metaphors, but knowing their own reason for them. So it becomes like a secret code, which I think is cool. I thought you'd like to have the biblical references, so I made you a slide with John 10 and 11, where he talks about, I am a good shepherd, the good shepherd giveth his life for the sheep, and then the 23rd Psalm. So it's interesting to see these parallels. Now, just a little more about orant figures. They're found in both Jewish and pagan art. We even find them in non-Western art. We find them in art of the world, in all different cultures. And so they're symbols of faith in Christian art for the soul of the deceased. And of course, in other religions, they may have other meanings, but here they're symbols for the soul of the deceased. So these orant figures, they're floating in empty space, so they're totally detached from the physical world. Notice the style. We can look back to the baby Moses for this. They're a flat frontal, big eyes again, these very heavy outlines, and very clear color, very easy to understand, very simplistic. In the story of Jonah, the new religion can reference its connection to the Jewish tradition. And remember, Jonah stayed in the belly of the whale for 3 days before he was spat out. Christ was entombed and arose from the dead 3 days later. So early beginning to these parallels. So these Christian communities are organized geographically and along the lines the way Roman provincial governments were organized, which is interesting. And if you think about it, that many of these early influential Christians were early influential Roman statesmen. And so they're beginning to organize these hierarchies along the lines of organization that they know works. They created senior church officials as governors of dioceses, often headquartered them in former capitals, and they had a constant flow of money. So they were able to become very powerful very quickly. They were very smart about the way they did it, and they bought up a lot of land. The cathedral was called the Bishop's Throne, and eventually the Bishop of Rome becomes the Pope, the head of the Western Church, and the Patriarch of Constantinople becomes the head of the Eastern Church, and we'll see how some of that plays out. But early on, the Christian Church is a political entity. Now, they remain united until 1054. So just to give you this simplified evolution. So this is, how do I put it? this is an evolution of the organization of the Christian church, and their beliefs systems split right here at this little triangle, right around 1000 or so, where the Christian and the Western or Eastern Orthodox churches split, and that's over a doctrinal dichotomy. But back here we have the Roman Empire, around 27 BCE. So this is before Christ is born. Christ is born somewhere in here in the middle of this line. And then if you remember, Diocletian divided up the Roman Empire into four. We had those four tetrarchs. And so we have this Western Empire and then the Eastern or Byzantine Empire. So before Christianity really gets started, we've already got these two empires. So Constantine becomes emperor, not empire, right around here. And he officially, Christianity is officially recognized in 313. And so 17 or so, 18 years later, Constantine transferred the capital from Rome in Western Europe to Constantinople in the East. So in 395, the Roman Empire split into Western and Eastern empires, and the Western Empire collapsed. They had invasions from the north, and they really become very weak for a while, and all of the strength and power is in the East, in the Eastern Byzantine Empire. But now along here, there's a growing rift between Western and Eastern churches, and they begin arguing about doctrine. So in 1054, the Christian church officially splits into Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, and I'll talk to you more about that when we get up to here. And then the Byzantine Empire ended after this course ends. So in 1453, that is the 15th century, or in the beginnings of the Renaissance. So that's in art history too. So it's interesting to look at this timeline and think about what happened in the Christian church and its organization. Here's a few early Christian symbols as we find them in sarcophagi and the catacombs. Now, Jews are forbidden to make images that could be worshipped as idols, as are Muslims, by the way. And as you shall see, this becomes a very hot, controversial subject within Christian art as well as Christianity evolves. So, in the early times, as we've already talked about, Christianity rose up out of Judaism, and they had a lot of common symbols. So they could use these images to instruct and to glorify God. And if you go online and just Google Christian symbols, you find so many different things. It's unbelievable. So here's just three things. The fish, as it's shown in a number of early Christian catacomb paintings, and the fish is used often today. Peacocks, grapes, grapevines, and the Chiro monogram. This 4th century, it's a sarcophagus made for, I think it's from the sarcophagus of Junius Bossus, but I'm not sure. And then of the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. So I made a slide about the Lamb. Let's just take a look, for example, at the Lamb. And all these other symbols that I've showed you, you could do this with them as well. And for these 4, there are probably 100. So we've got the Lamb lying down. He's a symbol of wounded flesh of Christ. And if he's standing, he's the church triumphant. If he's holding a cross with blood pouring out of his side, you can see in the lower right here, that would be the Agnus Dei, or the Lamb of God. And it symbolizes the crucified Christ and the Eucharist. And if it's holding a staff with a banner decorated with a cross, so obviously some of these are combinations of a couple of these different things, it would represent the resurrection and the Christ as the Redeemer. And this is the Lamb of the Apocalypse. He's on the book with the 7 seals. Here's Christ as the Good Shepherd from the second half of the 3rd century. So, as I stated earlier, as we move along into early Christian art, we can see that the influences and patrons become more powerful. And this was actually found with sculptures depicting Jonah. So we see the Roman classical influences here, but we can infer the Christian context of it all. And again, the lamb is a sacrificial animal that appears frequently in the Old Testament. It's the Jewish sacrifice eaten at the Passover before the Jews fled from Egypt. And then also the blood of the lamb is smeared on the doors of the Israelites. So the Exodus 12, this is the ancient foundation for the lamb as a Christian symbol. If you just look at the execution of this little sculpture, this is a very sophisticated work done with knowledge and detail, and its patron is clearly someone with influence. It isn't made sketchily or quickly. It's commissioned for a purpose. I've given you, here is a link to Christian symbols, so it'll be fun for you to look at. Now here's an important word for you to remember is syncretism. And syncretism is the combination of symbols from the old and new. So everything that I've been showing you so far is syncretism. This actually is an image of Christ Helios and is from the necropolis underneath Old St. Peter's in Rome, just so you know what this is. The vines of Dionysus, or Bacchus in the Roman, have become the vines of Christ. So it symbolizes the church body. I am the vine, you are the branches. And we have the pagan sun god Apollo merged with Christ as the sun. So it's exalting the deity as well as teaching and inspiring worshipers. So early Christian churches were meant to be seen from both inside and outside, and we are ready now to begin the move from the catacombs to the churches. So although this is from a necropolis underneath Old St. Peter's, these mosaics and this imagery is getting ready to spring into the light of day. So in this process, artists assimilate images from other traditions. In pagan art, he's Hermes the shepherd, Orpheus among the animals. In Jews, the 23rd Psalm. Christians, Christ is the good shepherd. So that's your sort of wrap-up of this concept of syncretism. Now, Constantine is our first Christian emperor. And you've seen this arch before. We looked at this arch at the end of the Roman chapter. It was created to commemorate his military victory over Minucius. This is meant to commemorate Constantine as a builder, and this is not a Christian monument per se. It commemorates his military victory over Maxentius, but it heralds the greatness of Constantine as the first Christian empire, and he builds the first great Christian basilica. And so here is a reconstruction drawing of Old St. Peter's by Constantine I. So he began this building program in 324. Of course, he built that arch in 312, so that's kind of a precursor to it. And so once Christianity is legal, Christians can make architectural spaces. So, of course, the first Christian churches are going to use the Basilica-Plan, which we learned about last time, which the Romans used for courts of law. And there's a reference here. And also, if you want to read about the founding of Christianity and also some controversy over Constantine and dates, I've given you a link here. So here in this first Old St. Peter's, which actually is no longer with us, it was torn down, and we'll get to that, we have sort of this Basilica plan over here. It's got side aisles and then a nave up the center for the worshipers, a Roman atrium with a fountain in it, and then a clear story to let in light and a transept across the back. So we have a new phase of Christianity now that incorporates both Greek and Roman philosophy, which is reflected in the increase in imperial architecture. So, humans, once the Romans adopt Christianity as their official religion, they don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. They keep many of the basic tenets of philosophy, many of the basic tenets of classical learning. They certainly continue the way that they're building their architecture, but things get added to accommodate the Christian faith. So this was begun around 320 to 327. The atrium was a later addition. And here's a drawing of what the inside of it would have looked like. So this is typical for an early Roman Christian basilica, and there are lots of them. And so you can see we have these two side aisles, and then looking straight up through the nave, this is the apse where the altar would have been. Clear story up here, these windows that would let in light. It really depended on the size. There's a great contrast usually between exterior simplicity and interior luxury, as we shall see in Christian buildings. They don't decorate the outsides that much, but they decorate the insides. So what we know about Old St. Peter's is based on drawings of it and written descriptions of it. So again, this is a reconstructive and plan of the Basilica Oppia in Rome. So we can extrapolate from this drawing of this Roman basilica that was built around AD 112, what Old St. Peter's would have been like. So this is not a drawing of Old St. Peter's, it's this Roman basilica, but I'm showing it you here to give you the roots of what the construction of Old St. Peter's is. Here's a comparison. So Old St. Peter's, if you notice, very similar feel of the interior space, but we have this altar and an apse in the back, and so we have this longitudinal focus that we don't necessarily have with the Basilica Oppia. So the narthex across the building protects 5 doorways, and the nave goes up 1 story higher than the side aisles to let light into the nave. So the side aisles are over here. The clear story, here's the clear story. So if you go under where these columns are, the roof is lower. I thought this would be a good place just to give you some basic diagrams of different kinds of plans of Christian churches. And we have 2 kinds of churches at this era. We have Basilica-Plan, which we've just looked at, which generally have an atrium to the front. They have a long nave with side aisles. The narthex is here where you enter from the atrium to the nave, and then an apse where the altar would be, and a transept that goes across right before the apse. We also have what's called central plan churches, which rather than this longitudinal focus, it's equidistant, and it's built on the idea of the perfection of the circle with an atrium again in the front. So 2 different kinds of churches that we'll see. This is just another interior of an early Christian Basilica-Plan church that does still exist. This was begun around 385 and rebuilt after a fire in 1823, so it was rebuilt in the 19th century, and you can go here today. And so if you look at this, you can get some kind of an idea what the inside of Old St. Peter's might have been like. This was actually begun a century after Old St. Peter's, and it's ending in a triumphal arch. It's hard to see here, but the triumphal arch, which is similar to the Arch of Constantine, it leads to the sanctuary where the altar is located. And it also is the first church in Rome dedicated to the Virgin Mary. The Council of Ephesus, and if you study the history of Christianity and Christian beliefs, it's very interesting, different kinds of councils they had and different ways they added belief systems into this tapestry that becomes the Christian religion as we know it today. They declared Mary to be what they call Theotokos, which is Greek for the bearer of God. So this is the first church in Rome dedicated to her after this council. So they had this council, then they built her a church. Here are some mosaics from this church of Santa Maria Maggiore from 432 to 440. And you can see how perfect the mosaic medium is for early Christian art, because we can continue the simplification of the drawing that they have, these bands of figures, very clear and frontal, large eyes, dark outlines. And again, they're reflecting this classicizing style of Roman art and their Old Testament stories, Jewish patriarchs and heroes within this church built for Mary. Very solid three-dimensional rendering to these figures, even though they're made from mosaic, and just a hint of perspective in the landscape settings. The stones are called tesserae. And there's more about this in your text. So just so you can have an example of a central plan church, we will look at the plan and section of the Church of Santa Costanza in Rome around 338 to 350. A tomb with a central plan and vertical axis gets used as a plan for Christian buildings. So the Church of Santa Costanza actually began as a mausoleum or tomb for Constantina, the daughter of Constantine, but it morphs into the Church of Santa Costanza. So here's what it looks like inside. This is a view through the ambulatory, which is the part where you walk around the outside, into the central space with the altar at the center. So we have these double rings of paired columns, and note the capitals. They're composite capitals, so they're partly Corinthian capital and partly other leaves and branches, all supporting the arcade and the dome. And here is a mosaic from the ambulatory vault of Santa Costanza. So here's our grapes theme again that we saw from the mausoleum under Old St. Peter's. This is called the Harvesting of Grapes, and it's a mosaic from 338 to 350, clearly now within a Christian church setting and, openly done. So look how real these figures are. This man's holding the whip. He's got this cart full of grapes here, the rendering of these oxen, all done with mosaics. And so it's a recollection of the syncretism present in the catacombs, but a much more physical, a much more sophisticated version of it, with these little putti harvesting the grapes. The technique, the style, the subject is all Roman, but the wine of Bacchus has totally become the wine of the Eucharist. And here, I just wanted to give you a close-up of the detail of this, the beauty and the detail of these pheasants. There you can see even his tail and all the foliage and the floral. And so, interestingly, Constantina was Christian, but her husband was pagan. And so the mosaics had double meaning. And the art form is rooted in their tradition. And at this time in history, it's a very interesting time in history because the two of them could celebrate their two religions together. Just to give you a little bit of different kinds of art that happened at the time, and we'll wrap up with these last couple of images. This is a little diptych found in Rome. It's only 1 by 5 inches, and it's carved ivory. So it's very solidly Roman forms, but is depicting Christ's resurrection. So there's many of these. They're inscribed with the names of people to be prayed for. So you would carry this and you would pray for whoever was inscribed onto the back. Very natural poses here, solid modeling of the figures, beautiful detailing of the doorway. Classical roots in this Christian work. Here is a detail of the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus, or Bassus. And I've given you a link to more information about this sarcophagus because the story of Junius Bassus is just very interesting one. He was a Roman statesman who didn't declare his Christianity until after his death. And so we have this classical image of Christ, and we have the down here the tree of life. Scenes are dividing columns. They're showing evidence in the Old and New Testaments. Narrative scene completely in the Roman style. If you look back, for example, to the Roman sarcophagus that we saw a few weeks ago, the styling is completely the same, but there's three-dimensional representation of these paintings found in the catacombs. So a very early example of the way Christian art parallels Old and New Testament stories. And your book has more about the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus as well.